Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you a lot for all your engagement yesterday. Today we are focusing on the theme of cultural policy. And we're starting with the intervention by Lluis Bonet, who is a professor at the University of Barcelona. And in his work, he is focused on researching cultural policies, cultural management, and cultural participation. He will be talking about some pitfalls and troubles that democracy is encountering nowadays with the changes in different societies, like rise of illiberal democratic forms. And also he will delve into some outputs and from the researches he's doing in the past years. So in the next 45 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes, he will present us with the insights he gained, and afterwards we will have a chance to ask some questions or give comments. Lluis, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a big pleasure to be here back in Zagreb and to be in this fantastic seminar. So thanks for inviting me. As Antonija just said, I will use different researches I'm doing. One of them is what Luca Ricci was presenting yesterday. We are part of this action research project. The name of is Be Spectative, and some of the materials that I will present comes from this research. Others comes from a couple of articles we are at this very moment writing. One using the case of Hungary and Poland and illiberal democracies and how they are changing cultural policies. By the way, these are the two countries who increase the most their cultural budget in the last years. So it's interesting to know that. So the countries who are increasing the most their cultural budgets are illiberal democracies countries. So it's important to have this in mind. So what I will propose you for this session is I will start talking a little bit about cultural policies paradigms and political regimes. I will later focus a little bit more on participation strategies in both kind of systems. And later I will present the results of another research I'm doing, which is on audience strategies, and I will talk about the connection between them and the paradigms of cultural policy, the traditional paradigms of cultural democracy, cultural democratization, excellence, and so on. So I will talk a little bit on that. And final reflection. So that's a little bit what I will propose for this session. So I will start talking a little bit about this, but just to have in mind which have been the paradigms, the main paradigms which are behind Western cultural policies. I want just to remember you, just is the evolution in the last century. These are the traditional paradigms that comes from the 19th century. So the first liberal democracy cultural policies started with this. Of course, when we talk about liberal democracies, it's totally different the ones of during the Victorian time and the current ones in the 21st century. So it's not the same thing. Of course, things change, thanks God, sometimes. But these are, as you can see, academic art promotion. It was a very important paradigm in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, it's not anymore. But the other ones still exist, But to understand, really, one of the most important changes in liberal democracy cultural policies is important to think the shock and later the reaction to totalitarian regimes cultural policy. Because that explains why from after the Second World War, freedom of speech was an important element to be protected. And that's why avant-garde artists receive quite a lot of support, and why the concept of excellence and who could legitimize this excellence was important at this very moment. So that's why the new paradigms that had been added from this moment, in a way, are a reaction to totalitarian instrumentalization of cultural policies. So we can talk about the new understanding of excellence, and I think Andrew was presenting yesterday how even this concept is changing today, which is quite interesting. Cultural democratization, which started very strongly in the in the 50s and the 60s, especially in the 60s, and cultural democracy, which is the paradigm that we will talk the most and interest the most for us here in this seminar, with these different approaches. So they started mainly in the 70s, in this battle between cultural democracy and cultural democratization in the early 70s after the 68 revolution. And and later, cultural development, both in the domestic and in the international cooperation approach, cultural diversity and cultural rights in the UNESCO approach was very important in that. And in the last times, all the commons, the cultural commons, all this movement in the left, which are defending a new approach to cultural democracy. And of course, the last one, which is quite important as well, and it's important to have in mind, all this economic impact that started in the 80s, and later all this creative economy that was imposed at the end of the 90s and during the beginning of the 21st century. These are, in a very synthetic, because this is a synthesis, in a very synthetic way, the kind of paradigms that exist on today liberal democracies. Of course, liberal democracies are very different, so there is not just a single model, there are many, many models inside, but it's important to have this, because I want to compare that with illiberal democracies. So, the main question is, illiberal democracy is in between liberal democracy and totalitarian regimes. So we know more or less what liberal democracies are, with all their many submodels and governance traditions from the UK. Yesterday we were talking about the UK, but we can talk what happens in liberal democracies in other parts of the world, so they're quite different. And totalitarian states with, as well, quite a lot of difference inside, from communism to fascism, but the different degrees of totalitarian. For instance, talking about China, today, China's cultural policy, which kind of model is following? And it's quite interesting to analyze it, because it's a power which is growing influence worldwide. And it's now one of the main founders, financial founders of UNESCO. So it's important to have this kind of thing in mind. And the other issue is not to confuse populist strategies with illiberal democracies. This is not exactly the same. They are using populist strategies, both far right and far left illiberal democracies. In Europe, we know mainly on far right, but in other parts of the world, we can even see far left illiberal democracies with populist strategies. And it's important to have this in mind in order to have the whole picture. So I will use some examples. At national level, Hungary and Poland are quite interesting, but at local level, it's quite interesting to see what happens, for instance, in the local governments in France, managed by Front National, or in Italy by La Lega, or in other parts of Europe. Of course, outside the European Union, we can as well see what is happening in the eastern border, so from Russia and so on. So these are examples that we have to have in mind. And another issue is how close these cultural policies are to soft dictatorship. Of course, what is hard and what is soft dictatorship is not as easy, but because I grew up in Spain and during Franco's time, Frankism started as being a totalitarian state with totalitarian cultural policies. But in the 60s, they moved to soft dictatorship cultural policies, copying the models of UNESCO, but adapting to dictatorship. So, of course, a stronger and explicit censorship, but at the same time, using a lot of the arguments, a lot of the strategies of democratic cultural policies. So it's quite interesting to do this kind of comparative analysis, even today, because analyzing the Spanish case at local and regional level, I can see many practices which are traditionally from illiberal democracy systems. So I will present the theoretical scheme that we are using for the comparative analysis in the case of Poland and Hungary, based on these 4 key variables. But as well, we did a research with a colleague on the case of Argentina. We analyzed the Kirchnerism, which is a part of the left wing of Peronism in Argentina, the one that now they just won these past elections, this populist tradition, a very strong populist tradition in Peronism. But we also analyze the Macri government, so the conservative, they are as well using populist strategies. So it's quite interesting, and we published this paper 2 years ago using in the Bilgi Yearbook of Cultural Policy. So this is the theoretical framework we are using in this new text that we are finishing at this very moment with Mariano Zamorano. And these are the key elements. So political organization, of course, this is a theoretical framework. A theoretical framework doesn't mean it applies automatically to every country, because many countries or many situations are in between. We can say this model is in between liberal democracy and illiberal democracy. This is more closer. If the Russian is China between the totalitarian state and the illiberal democracy, we could discuss this. But the theoretical frames help us to organize our ideas. But we have to understand that this is a scheme, it's not a photo of reality. So political organization, so how democratic elections are organized, if there is separation of power or not, if civil liberties, division of power and transparency works or not works in the different places. This is a first step. The second step is which kind of definition of culture, what is the approach to culture, these different theoretical models with all the differences inside, but these different models. So what we can see is in the 21st century liberal democracy, this was not the case in the beginning of the 20th century, is the case today, national culture could be in plural or not, that depends on the country, progressively understood not only as what constitutes the roots of the nation, but as an aggregation of cultural rights, our origins and expressions. So that, of course, that doesn't happen everywhere, but this is an evolution of liberal democracies' approach to culture and political identity. When we analyze what happens in illiberal democracies, mainly what they do is a national nativism and historical revisionism. In Poland, in Hungary, it's very clear, but as well when we analyze in Italy what the Lega is proposing, or the Front National in France, or in Finland, or in Sweden, or in Austria now. In Austria there is now a coalition between the conservative and the far-right government, far-right party. So this idea of Eurocentrism, Christianity, these kind of subjects are here. And it's a rejection, a very clear rejection of multiculturalism and and of cultural relativism. No? So, which is there is rejection of some minorities, mainly marginal minorities and so on. But just going a little bit more to the core of cultural policies, if we analyze the governance model, what we can see is, for instance, which kind of respect and support to a diverse civil society expressions. If they try to weaken the civil society, or they want to support this civil society independent sector. And that's something which is quite interesting to see. For instance, we could ask ourselves after the yesterday visit, in which way the city of Zagreb is supporting the civil society independent sector as a rhetoric approach, as a way to, or it's really something which they really believe. So analyzing the budgets, the different budgets, analyzing the rhetorics, we could try to understand that. Or another very important thing is the respect to civil servants and peer review with professional rules. For instance, one of the things that surprised us when the Front National got power in some municipalities in France was they said, oh, librarians, you don't have the right to decide which kind of book you have to have in the municipal library. We are elected politicians. We have the legitimation of the popular vote, and we don't like these books on Arabic language or etc. because there are immigrants living in the neighborhood. We want Jeanne d'Arc, big stories, Asterix and Obelix, yes, but not other kinds of cartoons. This was something that never before the Conservative Party or the Socialist Party did in France, in the sense that librarians are like curators, like artistic directors in theaters. They have the right to decide following their own rules, professional rules. But the Front National says, no, this is not true. You don't have the legitimation. We are legitimated by the democratic vote. And we want to impose our idea of what kind of culture we want to support and which kind of culture we don't like to support in our libraries, in our theaters, in our museums, and so on and so on. No? So that's as well something which is very, very relevant. And of course, and there are other things, which is, for instance, the idea of looking for clienteles. Which kind of clienteles? And for instance, later I will talk a little bit more on that, but when I will talk about the strategies, but it's very interesting to see how you could use beautiful arguments in order to impose your idea of who are the good people and who are the bad people, and what merits the good people and what merits the bad people. And that's part of the populist strategy of opposing elites and the peoples. And who is interpreting people will? So it's very, very interesting. So, and here we can see again, when going to in more detail on the policy strategies, the support to free creativity from academic to avant-garde arts based on meritocracy. What meritocracy means? In this battle between elite art and people's art, in many places they oppose that and they use this opposition, and we are the interpreters of what is people's will. So we don't believe of meritocracy who grows up from the art fields or the heritage field legitimation. The idea of corporativism and clienteles is in the core of illiberal democracy cultural policies. And the idea of monumentalization based on historical revisionism. What happens in Northern Macedonia in the former government was exactly that, no? This idea of Alexander the Great, the big monuments, etc., monumentalization, which is a policy, is a cultural policy used historically by the Romans. That's why we saw so many emperators, sculpture of the emperators all over the empire, and that's something which has been done always, no? And as well, the different alliances with private media, which is very interesting to see this, how it changed. Of course, that also happens in liberal democracies, of course, but in illiberal democracies it is done in a much more direct and without any kind of problem. So what we see really, excuse me, there is this alliance. Of course, there is quite a lot of self-censorship. Self-censorship, because it's not needed to do direct censorship. It's easier to cut the budgets for your own projects. So many people tries to survive doing self-censorship. And that's the case in many countries that from a formal point of view are democracies with elections, change of governments, and so on. But in a practical way, you are afraid of the reactions of what you are doing. So what kind of citizens or audience participation is supported by the different models of cultural policy? So in illiberal democracies, we don't see big differences between left-wing and right-wing populist strategies on the field of cultural policy. And that's a little bit the result of our research in the Argentinian case. So these are the most common strategies from both sides, left and right. The idea of constructing a new us could be more traditional cultural nationalism in the right wing and maybe a little bit more social-oriented cultural patriotism. So even the use of the words, nationalism versus patriotism. Social patriotism versus traditional cultural nationalism. But finally, the strategies are the same. Who is building this new us against the elite? The use of an organization of free or very cheap popular cultural large events, where tickets are distributed through clientele circuits. I remember some years ago, I was giving a lecture on financing the arts in the province council of Alicante in the southeast part of Spain. And I was starting teaching on price policy. I'm an economist, so I was teaching price policy. And the director of the Cultural Council of Benidorm is a huge touristic city, he told me, please, we can avoid this topic because we don't need price policy. And I asked him, well, and how do you do when you organize this wonderful festival, you invite fantastic artists in your theaters? And his answer was very easy, was the culture of culture, the politician of culture, he distributes the tickets among their colleagues and friends. So he's using public money to give, you are my friend, you are my clientele, I give you a ticket. You are not, you don't have it. So they don't need, and the argument was, we are doing free art for the people. But this is exactly the same that happens in Venezuela. I was in Venezuela, and in the beginning of Chavism, and I remember going to the Teresa Carreño Theater, and I wanted to see a performance, and it was not possible to buy the tickets, because now the tickets were free. But not all the Venezuelan population was allowed to go to the theater, because only the clienteles received the tickets. So this is part of the kind of strategy. Of course, propagandistic use of governmental mass media, governmental use of internet and social media, very intense use of this, huge use. They invest a lot of money on that. Ideological bias on cultural venues content programming. I explained the case of libraries, theaters, exhibitions, but even TV series. Which kind of TV series are presented in the allied private sector or in governmental TVs? They talk about the glorious past of the nation. They talk about the new invention on what is the social patriotism. And of course, much more money allocated on cultural budget. But culture understood much more from an anthropological approach, not from the traditional arts and heritage approach. That's why it's culture, leisure, media strategy all together. And that is because this is the people will, or their interpretation of what the people will is about. There are some specificities. In the right wing, there is a more individual, consumer-oriented clientele. So the idea of the consumer. Yes, that is the use of the creative industry branding as the big solution for everywhere, which is of course very close to what conservative parties do in any case, but they are as well this logic. And very important, very strong governmental alliance with large cultural corporations and with large private media. What we don't know yet, if it's happening or not, what is happening in China. I was last summer invited to the PhD summer school in China, PhD students from, there were a selection of 50 students from the best universities of China on the field of culture industries, and talking with them, and well, some of the universities there receive the data, the individual personalized data of single people with name, age, where they live, etc., and all the consumption, or cultural consumption. So which kind of songs they were sharing with other friends and colleagues, which kind of things, the pictures, everything. And the universities in China are analyzing this data because this is what the Communist Party are interested to know. So this is an extreme. Probably in this case, we are very close to totalitarian cultural policy, but I'm asking myself if in these alliances between public and private sector in right wing, if we are not seeing the same kind of strategy. We don't know. I didn't get this information. I know the information in China because I was with them, but I don't know if it's as well happening in other parts of the world. And in the left-wing area, and here I can only talk about Latin American experiences, there is a more cultural democracy oriented. So the idea of cultural democracy as a paradigm is stronger, and the idea of the cultural rights of allied, marginalized communities. The key word is allied. Of course, we talk about indigenous people, we talk about different traditional marginalized communities. It's a social approach, but the allied ones. Okay. In liberal democracies, what we see is that participation, it is in all the traditional paradigms, not only in cultural democracy paradigms. Sometimes we did the mistake to only analyze cultural democracy, but also as well in cultural democratization, even in creative economy or in the excellence, we could see. And what is interesting to see, and I try now to be a little bit faster because I see my watch and time is coming up. And in any case, we published this in an article in Poetics, so you can just read it. So what is interesting to see is the intersection between the different paradigms and how participation could be here. So between the paradigm of cultural democracy, cultural democratization, and creative economy, we have all the crowdfunding strategy. Or we can analyze all what we try to do with engaging critical citizens and this idea of empowering audience. It is in between the cultural democratization and the cultural democracy paradigm. So we could, of course, go much deeper, but I won't do that now in order to skip a little bit of time. And this is part of another article I published recently with Emmanuel Negre, which is one of my colleagues in Montpellier, where we analyze audience strategies. In this, as you can see in the first column, we talk about in between the cultural democracy and the cultural democratization paradigm and the different goals from to give loyal audiences or to renew audiences, to develop audiences, or to empower audiences, which are different kind of goals. Some of them closer to cultural democracy and others more closer to traditional cultural democratization strategies. And what we try to analyze here is which kind of main trends, what kind of example of that, the effects and the challenges. Again, I'm sorry not to have now time to explain in detail everything, but if you are able to read Spanish, because this was published in Spanish, you can read this paper, and in any case, we will publish quite soon in English as well, so don't worry. But and you will have, in any case, the presentation, so you could read more carefully the results of the research. Sorry to go in this way, but of course, personally, and in our Bespectative project, we were interested particularly in how to empower audiences and which kind of effects and which kinds of challenges, because not everything is easy. There are contradictions in how we do things, and it's important to have this in mind, because we can have a lot of wish, but the way we do things influencing the result, and there are some challenges here. Okay, I will only save one idea from what we did in this exercise, and I will use not the performing arts, because Bespectative is about performing arts. I use the case of the cultural heritage just to see that you could use that in different cultural sectors, which is the tension between building capacity for empowerment and sharing power. So I'm going back to yesterday's presentation when we were talking just about sharing power. Okay, and here we analyze different strategies from the ones who there is little building capacity for empower, and at the same time it's not a lot of sharing power, to the ones who really shares. And here you can see that the idea of doing things, interactive part recommendation, visits to special places, workshops, training with visitors, these are traditional dynamics that we do on audience development, which could have some kind of building capacity, but we share very little. We share very little power with these audiences. When I'm in a museum, when I'm in a theater, and there are special things that is more than the normal visit, more than the normal showing the play. Here we can see the volunteers, and what is the work of volunteers. There is a little bit more of sharing power, and of course of building capacity. And here we can have other kinds of amateur researcher, art and heritage collector, or volunteering as a board member of a museum or volunteer curators or volunteer producers, which are different strategies we could use. And it's interesting to see in which way we are really sharing or not sharing power. Because, of course, we can share power in the sense that an open vote for the best, or which would be the artists that we will invite next year in a festival. And of course, we are sharing power, but we are not building capacity for empowerment. But when we do what we do, for instance, with this, in the case that Luca Ricci explained in San Sepolcro and in many other parts, in this case, we are empowering these people to select something which really interests their community. It's not, they are not selecting because they love it. They select because they feel is something which could interest the community. And there is a huge debate. There is a growing capacity building through this process. Okay? So, some key challenges of contemporary cultural policy. I think that we have to renew our approach in the sense that when we talk about excellence and enlightenment, I think the key issue is in which way experience affects and change people. Or when we think about risk assumption, the idea is, are we able to help and to support artists and audiences crossing uncertain frontiers? Or when we talk about international openness, are we really thinking on reciprocal flow? Or the rich countries, the well-known countries impose their artists and their products to the poor and unknown countries? Or when we talk about cultural diversities, are really there a reflex and an expression of heterogeneous communities? So these are some of the big issues. And of course, we can see in which way we are doing reinterpretation, in which way the core strategy is experimentation, the core idea is artistic, active citizens, the core idea is the redefinition of the governance models. Of course, again, this scheme could give a lot of discussion, but I think it's important to think from a liberal democracy approach. We could be Victorian style, or we could be much more open in this direction. Because when we talk about liberal democracies, what is liberal democracies? It's a huge group of submodels. And my final two slides. One slide for liberal democracies, and a second slide for illiberal democracies. So when we analyze participation, I think we have to analyze the mix of reasons behind participatory practices. Because one thing is the expectations, another thing is the reality, both by the project and by the audiences. And sometimes we have to be to see if there is a fashion, or there is really a political interest, or there is a need for legitimation, or there is real social pressure, bottom-up social pressure, or there is audience looking for involving experiences. There are many reasons on this new wage of participation. The second thing is the heterogeneous participatory practices with unequal power effects and involvement. And I think this is important to have into account when we really analyze. So we need to go deeper in the analysis of the impact of cultural, technological, and political change, and the importance of the regional context, the policies, the values, and the experiences. In transitional economies, like in Croatia, we can analyze them and what the independent sector is doing without understanding in which kind of framework you are. So that's why it's so important to really contextualize each situation, and that is why it's so difficult to do comparative analysis. Some risks and some challenges: prestige, curator experience, instrumentalization. These are risks. We have to work in these risks in order to be able to go further. And what it means, real democratization and equitable mediation. So it's not so equity. It's a very important concept, and we have to work because we have to think about social diversity, horizontality, and so on. And finally, the organization challenges for our museums, for our theaters, for our libraries, for our arts projects. There is a reassignment of priorities when we decide to invest on real participation. And that means how much money do we allocate? How key people do we allocate in this kind of new tasks and responsibilities? Because one thing is the rhetoric, another thing is the resources allocated to participation. Team motivation and team preparation, different skills. We need people with different skills. And how to evaluate the results and impact of participatory practices. This is, of course, a big challenge because it's long-term impacts. So these are some reflections in the world of liberal democracies, participatory policies. And that is the final slide on illiberal democracies policies. Audience participation is mainly a form of legitimation and a form of segregation, both. So this idea of people culture against elite culture. But who defines what is people culture? There is a recreation of national culture, and of course, the love to the leader, against stigmatized and foreign cultural identities and expressions. And, of course, the idea of spreading fake or interesting news. Another issue is that cultural participation is as a tool to strengthen the feeling of clan belonging and to ensure loyal to clienteles instead of a tool for building capacities and critical empowerment. They're using participatory techniques, but the goal is a totally different goal. So big events were sharing values, collective emotions and feelings of belonging among large addict audiences. Emotion, sharing emotions is very important as a strategy. And culture is a wonderful space for that. That is why they are increasing cultural budgets. And voluntary work for addicts to the cause, for self-esteem, feeling of clan belonging, and community recognition. We see a lot of volunteer people helping them. And finally, artistic and participatory projects are potential space of freedom and citizen opposition. Because in illiberal democracies, political opposition exists. Independent cultural sector exists. Something which doesn't exist in totalitarian states. So, important role of the independent civil society, sometimes in alliance with political opposition and local or regional governments. And I think the example of Poland is very clear on this. So, that's all. Puno wala. Thank you very much. Here are the reference here. As well, the publications we are preparing for next year, so which are more focused on what I was presenting today.
Thank you very much. We will steal a few minutes from the break since we started a little bit late. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. I would start maybe with the question that somehow was running through my mind. In a certain sense, when we allocate illiberal democracies, we usually think about Poland and Hungary and so on. But somehow we can also see similar trends in many societies that are not defined as such. And it seems that these are the strategies that we can see in illiberal democracies are very attractive. And could you maybe trace how deep does it go? How many societies are already affected by this kind of behavior?
Well, as I told you, I present a theoretical framework. As liberal democracy was an homogenized model, illiberal democracy was another homogenized model, and totalitarian states were as well. And we know that this is not true. But, you know, academics, we need this kind of theoretical framework. What it means that we can see a progression from very liberal democracy pure models to more illiberal ones, and in general, my experience, but I don't develop any specific research yet, is that countries with former authoritarian regimes are in much more danger than the ones with long-term democratic tradition. So I know very well the Spanish case, and because we were most of our 19th century and 20th century, we were under dictatorship, we know a lot about this kind of cultural policies. And even we are, in theory, a liberal democracy, what is happening in these last years in Spain is horrible, because we have artists in the jail. There is at this very moment the deputy mayors of culture not permitting, for instance, I was talking the other day in Lisbon in another European project. I was invited with the communication head of the Zaragoza City Council. Now, for instance, they don't allow them to invite any Catalan artists in Zaragoza. And this is, in theory, a liberal party politician. And this is what is happening in a country like Spain. If we analyze the case of Turkey, but what happens in the Balkans? So, of course, we can see some examples of what I call illiberal democracy cultural policies in formally liberal democracies. And that's why we have to analyze much deeper that, and we have to preserve free expression and the values of liberal democracy.
My question goes maybe to this basic assumption that, of course, you say we academics, we need to make these differences, but in the differences we make, we take the decisions. And in this case, it is a certain decision to bring many different ways of acting together under the, let's say, under this category of the liberal democracy. Now, yesterday, this thing came in my mind that the fact that the liberal democracy is not as free as it might tell us to be could be one of the reasons why it is easier to become illiberal. I mean, this is what, looking at Austria, I think, in somehow I would say the neoliberalization to a certain extent is extracting the commons, is kind of expropriating the commons still talking about liberalism. This was what I tried to understand or discuss yesterday. But I don't know a lot about it, but what I know is that if this happens, we intellectuals have a role in it. And the way we explain things and the categories we do, we have a role in it. And in this sense, I would say, aren't we, so one of your basic assumptions is that only totalitarianism has organic intellectuals. But I would say every system of governance has organic intellectuals. And I personally think that mediators and curators are very much the organic intellectuals of neoliberalism. So in somehow we create imaginations of liberal democracy where it's almost not yet there anymore. And what does it mean for us? This would be my question.
There are different levels of organic intellectuals. In totalitarian states, the difference is really hard. I recommend, I'm sorry because I'm so bad on remembering names, but there is a wonderful book written by the music critic of the New Yorker. I don't even know his name. He's a very well-known man, but it's a very interesting book that he explains the evolution of the music sector and the critics during the 20th century. And in this book, he explains the situation in the Soviet Union during the Stalinism and the role of composers. And I think it's very interesting to analyze how, so we can of course talk about organic intellectuals even in liberal democracies. But when we see what happens in totalitarian democracies, we see that there is a huge difference. I think we have to be aware, we have to criticize what is happening in our societies, but it's not exactly the same that happens in totalitarian societies. I don't remember the name of this guy. I really recommend you this book because it's a fantastic book about the 20th century evolution of the musical sector. I'm sure, The Noise, the name of the book is The Sound, sorry, maybe later.
Yeah, okay. Okay, we can take 2 more questions, so I don't know, please.
Hi, thank you. I was actually delighted to see your slide on your final reflections on illiberal democracies. I ticked off all of those for my country right now. Under the Modi rule, we we fit all of that. I just want to add one thing that has been part of our experience. The first one, people culture against elite culture, there's a card of victimhood, historical victimhood that's played out, and culturally, new icons are picked up from history, things that were totally irrelevant or insignificant, but are made into these monumental new heroes culturally. And that's something that in I think a 2017 article in eFlux, Boris Gryos, I think is his, Groys, I don't know how to pronounce it. He wrote this fantastic article on Trump about this playing of the victim card and Trump's America. And so I was just wondering if that's something that you've also seen across other kinds of illiberal democracies, this picking up almost like a victim from history, making it look like the victimhood that's being and then celebrating it as a cultural hero over time.
As you can see, this last reference was published in this book coordinated by Milena Dražišević and Vickery. And this book is about cultural policy and populism, the rise of populism, and the crisis of political pragmatism. I recommend you this book because we have this article about the Argentinian case, but there are other articles who go in this direction of what you are saying.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for a very inspiring presentation. I was wondering, I think typologies of the sort that were presented here are very, very useful, kind of demonstrating democratization of culture, cultural democracy, economic instrumentalization, etc., etc. And I was intrigued by kind of the fact that, but still it's a reduction of complexity. Because in a way, when we make these typologies, we kind of a little bit assume that, you know, in the age of democratization of culture, there was no economic instrumentalization, because we skits them as the first one, typically. And there's something to it. But what was, I was intrigued by the fact as well that you kept the line going. That is, democratization of culture does not vanish when we're in the age of economic instrumentalization, for instance. So my question is a little bit then, when the complexity grows, is that a more accurate picture? Should we be talking about dominant discourses within the field rather than typologies that are reduction of complexities? So the basic question is, was there no economic instrumentalization in the age of democratization of culture? And my second point was a little bit, I would be interested in knowing how you empirically worked your way through kind of towards the theoretization in terms of fieldwork, in terms of textual material. What is the backbone of the typology? Thank you.
Well, the first question, of course, typologies, we need them, but they have limits. So that's why I was all the time saying, this is a conceptual, theoretical framework. This is not reality. But in any case, helps to organize our thoughts. So the economic aspect of cultural democratization, it's something which has been studied quite a lot, and as well the results of this democratization policy, which has been the most important cultural policy paradigm in the second half of the 20th century in the Western world. It's the most important. Cultural democracy was so small in comparison with the amount of money invested, and we question the impact of that. We know that cultural democratization didn't achieve the whole goals, and that was criticized yesterday. So that's clear. About the second question, in this paper that we are writing now, so in the case of the paper on Argentina, because my colleague is from Argentina, Martín Zamorano is from Argentina, we use a lot of material and documents from both governments, and so we analyze the concept of government in the city of Buenos Aires, when Macri used to be the mayor. The city of Buenos Aires' cultural budget is higher than the national government budget of culture, just to give you this information, okay? So it's very relevant. And we analyze the Kirchnerism, which is the left-wing part of Peronism, who was in the national government before that Macri, the former mayor, was elected president of the country. Now just happens the last elections, a couple of weeks ago, just changed because Macri lost the election. But our analysis is on the period 2000, I don't remember exactly, 2005, 2014. We analyzed this period because, of course, we need to focus our empirical analysis in a particular moment of time. In the case of Poland and Hungary, which are the two cases analyzed in this paper that we are writing now, Cultural Policies in Illiberal Democracies, a new conceptual framework based on the two European national government experiences, as the title says, we wanted to present the theoretical framework I was presenting today. And we use these two cases. We wanted, I must say, that our first hypothesis was to incorporate as well the Italian government, the coalition between the Lega and the Cinque Stelle. But after analyzing the Italian case, we realized that was not illiberal democracy. So just the empirical data show us that Italy was not a good example, was not a case, because the Ministry of Culture was in the hands of Cinque Stelle and not in the hands of the Lega. And the Lega, at the local level, yes, could be analyzed from this point of view in some cities in Veneto, in Lombardia, but even though in the regional government of Lombardia, the cultural policy of the Lega is a traditional conservative cultural policy. It is not at all on the umbrella of what we say illiberal democracy. So that's why we take out, because we wanted a Western case from a formal fascist country, but it didn't work. So empirical analysis is so important, always.
Thank you very much, Lluis. Thank you all for your engagement and participation. I suggest that we continue.